The day I found my mother-in-law crushing pills into my morning smoothie was the day I realized my entire family had been conspiring to keep me chemically compliant for nearly 8 months. What they didn't count on was that beneath their carefully manufactured haze, the real me was still fighting, and she was about to unleash a legal storm that would shatter their perfect little conspiracy. Standing in my kitchen at dawn, watching Ruth Miller grind white tablets into powder with the back of a spoon before stirring them into my usual breakfast blend, I felt the final piece of a horrifying puzzle click into place. The chronic fatigue that had plagued me for months, the inability to concentrate during important client meetings, the strange emotional numbness that had replaced my natural fire, the way my successful accounting practice had slowly crumbled while I watched like a passive observer from behind a wall of cotton. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Haze, though everyone in Millbrook, Connecticut calls me Becca from Haze Financial Consulting. At 38, I've built my financial planning business from scratch, turning a spare bedroom operation into a thriving practice that manages portfolios for over 40 local families and small businesses. I'm the type of woman who can spot market trends 3 months early, negotiate investment terms that make grown men sweat, and balance complex financial equations in my head while making dinner. At least, I was that woman until my world turned upside down last spring. I married Michael Haze 6 years ago after a whirlwind romance that started when he hired me to handle his late father's estate planning. Michael was a high school history teacher with kind eyes and a laugh that made me feel lighter than air. He was the opposite of the aggressive finance types I usually dated, gentle where they were demanding, supportive where they were competitive. Our wedding was small and perfect, held in the garden behind the colonial house we'd bought together on Elm Street, with white roses and string lights that made everything look magical. Michael was the kind of husband who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings and never complained when I worked late during tax season. He coached the varsity debate team and spent his summers writing curriculum for the school district. Our friends envied our partnership, the way we seemed to complement each other perfectly. He grounded my intensity while I challenged his comfort zone. We talked about having children someday, maybe taking that trip to Italy we'd been planning, growing old together in our house with its big front porch and maple trees. Then Michael's mother had her accident, and everything changed in ways I never could have anticipated. Ruth Haze had always been what people called a strong personality. At 65, she was a retired nurse who'd raised 4 children as a single mother after Michael's father died in a construction accident when Michael was 12. She was tough, opinionated, and absolutely devoted to her youngest son. Ruth had never quite warmed to me, though she was always polite. I suspected she thought Michael could have done better than a career-focused woman who didn't cook traditional meals or express much interest in domestic life. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Ruth was walking her neighbor's dog when an icy patch sent her tumbling down concrete steps, resulting in a broken hip, fractured wrist, and concussion that left her disoriented and unable to live alone. The doctors said her recovery would take months, possibly longer given her age and the severity of her injuries. Michael was beside himself with worry. Ruth had been fiercely independent her entire adult life, and the idea of her in a nursing home or assisted living facility was unthinkable to both of them. When he suggested she move in with us temporarily, I agreed without hesitation. Ruth was family, she needed help, and we had plenty of space in our 4-bedroom house. I converted my home office into a temporary bedroom, moving my desk and files to the basement guest room. We installed safety rails in the bathroom, rearranged furniture to accommodate her walker, and prepared for what we thought would be a few months of caregiving while Ruth regained her independence. What I didn't anticipate was how dramatically her presence would alter the dynamics of our marriage and my own sense of self. Ruth Haze was a small woman with silver hair she kept in a practical bob and piercing blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything around her. Despite her injuries, she insisted on contributing to the household from the moment she arrived. She Couldn't do heavy cleaning or cooking, but she could fold laundry, organize cupboards, and manage what she called the daily details that kept a home running smoothly. Within a week, Ruth had established routines that somehow became non-negotiable. She would wake early to start coffee and prepare breakfast, insisting it was the least she could do to help. She took over meal planning and grocery lists, claiming it gave her purpose during her recovery. Most significantly, she began making my morning smoothies, a habit I'd maintained for years as a quick, healthy way to start busy days. Ruth studied my routine with the dedication of a scientist. She learned that I preferred berries and spinach, that I added protein powder and almond milk, that I liked everything blended to perfect smoothness. She began preparing my smoothie each morning while I showered, presenting it to me with a warm smile and genuine concern for my health and well-being. Her attention felt caring, even maternal in a way I'd never experienced. My own mother had died when I was in college, and I'd been on my own for so long that having someone anticipate my needs felt like an unexpected gift. Ruth would ask about my day, listen to my concerns about difficult clients, and offer gentle advice about managing stress and maintaining work-life balance. What I didn't realize was that Ruth was conducting her own form of research, learning not just my preferences, but my patterns, my vulnerabilities, and my potential pressure points. The changes began so subtly that I attributed them to the stress of having an injured house guest and the disruption to our normal routines. April slipped into May, and I found myself struggling to maintain my usual sharp focus during client meetings. Numbers that should have been simple to calculate required multiple attempts. Investment strategies I'd recommended for years suddenly seemed overly complicated. My business partner, Sarah Chen, who'd worked with me for 3 years, started commenting on my apparent fatigue. She'd find me staring blankly at spreadsheets or struggling to remember details from conversations we'd had the day before. When she suggested I might be working too hard, I agreed, grateful for an explanation that made sense. At home, Ruth noticed my struggles with what seemed like genuine concern. She would find me at my basement desk, struggling to concentrate, on portfolio analysis, and gently suggest I take breaks. She'd bring me herbal tea and homemade cookies, settling nearby to chat about anything except work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her presence was comforting in a way that felt both nurturing and somehow wrong, like being cradled when I should have been standing. Michael noticed the changes too, but his interpretation was entirely different from Sarah's. He began making observations about how I seemed overwhelmed, suggesting that maybe I was taking on too many clients or pushing myself too hard to prove something. When I'd try to explain that my thinking felt cloudy, that basic calculations were taking longer than they should, he'd remind me that I was 38 now, not 25, and perhaps it was natural to feel less sharp than I had in my 20s. These conversations always seemed to happen in the evening, after I'd had my morning smoothie and whatever lunch Ruth had prepared. I'd feel too tired to argue effectively, too foggy to articulate what was wrong. Michael's suggestions would seem reasonable in the moment, even when part of me recognized they were completely out of character for our relationship. By June, I'd lost 2 significant clients, not because of catastrophic errors, but because of missed deadlines, confused communications, and a general sense that I wasn't operating at my usual professional level. Each loss felt devastating but also strangely distant, like watching someone else's career crumble through thick glass. The worst part was how understanding everyone seemed about my decline. Sarah covered for my mistakes with increasing frequency. Michael handled phone calls when I seemed too scattered to focus, and Ruth took over more household responsibilities to eliminate stress from my life. Their kindness felt suffocating, but I couldn't explain why without sounding ungrateful. Ruth's recovery was progressing well, according to her physical therapist, but she showed no signs of wanting to return to her own apartment. When Michael and I discussed timelines for her moving out, she would become tearful, explaining how much she valued being part of our daily lives, how isolated she'd felt living alone, how helpful she felt being able to contribute to our household. Michael couldn't bear to see his mother upset, and I found myself agreeing to extend her stay indefinitely. In my clearer moments, I recognized this as unusual behavior for me. I'd always been direct about boundaries, comfortable with difficult conversations, protective of my space and routines. But those clearer moments were becoming increasingly rare. July brought new challenges when Hartford Investments, my largest client, decided to move their account to a bigger firm in New York. The account represented nearly 30% of my income, and losing it should have sent me into crisis mode. Instead, I felt oddly detached from the devastating news. Ruth and Michael were full of reassurances about how this might be a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to focus on smaller, less demanding clients who wouldn't create as much pressure. I should have been networking aggressively, reaching out to every potential lead, working overtime to replace that lost revenue. Instead, I found myself taking long afternoon naps, agreeing when Michael suggested I raise my fees for remaining clients, accepting Ruth's advice to be more selective about new accounts. My business instincts, developed over 15 years in finance, seemed to have completely evaporated. Sarah finally confronted me in August. She'd watched me drift through meetings, miss important calls, and turn down potential clients for reasons that made no sense from a business perspective. She asked directly if something was wrong at home, if I was having health problems, if I needed to see a doctor. Her concern was genuine and terrifying because I couldn't explain what was happening to me. That evening, I tried to discuss Sarah's concerns with Michael. I explained that something felt fundamentally wrong with my thinking, my decision-making, my ability to function as a financial planner. He listened with apparent patience, then gently suggested that maybe Sarah was feeling threatened by the changes in our business dynamic, worried about her own job security if I continued scaling back. Ruth, who'd been quietly preparing dinner during our conversation, added that sometimes colleagues could be unsupportive when someone tried to create better work-life balance. She'd seen it happen at the hospital where she'd worked, nurses who couldn't handle it when someone else found peace and contentment. She suggested that maybe Sarah was projecting her own anxieties onto me. Their explanations felt reasonable in the moment, but something nagged at me afterward. Sarah had been nothing but loyal and supportive for 3 years. She'd worked late during busy seasons, covered for me when Michael had the flu, celebrated every business milestone with genuine enthusiasm. The idea that she was suddenly jealous or undermining made no sense, but I couldn't hold on to that clarity long enough to act on it. By September, my client base had shrunk to just 6 accounts. I was barely making enough to cover my business expenses, let alone contribute meaningfully to our household finances. Michael assured me this was temporary. That quality was more important than quantity, that we could manage on his teacher's salary while I figured things out. Ruth had gradually taken over answering my business phone during this period, explaining to callers that I was restructuring my practice and being more selective about new clients. She was professional and courteous, but she was also screening my calls and managing my schedule according to what she thought I could handle. When potential clients called about services, she'd take detailed messages but somehow never managed to relay them until days later, by which point they'd usually found another financial planner. I was losing my professional identity piece by piece, but the process felt as natural and inevitable as seasons changing. Ruth would bring me my morning smoothie and ask about my plans for the day. When I'd mention wanting to attend networking events or reach out to former clients, she'd gently point out how tired I looked, how important it was not to overcommit, how much Michael valued having me more present and relaxed at home. The transformation was so gradual, so wrapped in love and concern, that I barely noticed it happening. Everyone kept telling me how much better I looked, how much calmer I seemed, how nice it was to see me taking care of myself for once. Their approval felt like warm honey, coating over the growing panic I felt whenever I tried to access the sharp, decisive version of myself that had built a successful business. October brought the final professional catastrophe. Riverside Bank, my last major client, called to terminate our contract. When I asked for an explanation, they said Michael had contacted them to explain that I was dealing with some personal health issues and wouldn't be available for the foreseeable future. They needed consistent service and couldn't wait for me to resolve whatever was happening. I hung up the phone and felt something crack inside my chest. Michael had sabotaged my last significant client without consulting me, without even telling me he'd made the call. When I confronted him that evening, his response was devastating in its calm certainty. He sat me down at our kitchen table, took my hands in his, and explained that I'd been having what could only be described as a breakdown. Everyone could see it, he said. Ruth had noticed it first, how I'd become scattered and anxious, how I'd been making poor decisions that were damaging my reputation and our financial security. Ruth appeared as if summoned, settling beside me with a cup of chamomile tea and an expression of motherly concern. She explained that they'd been worried about me for months, watching me struggle with something I couldn't seem to identify or address. She'd seen similar patterns in colleagues who'd experienced burnout, depression, hormonal changes that affected cognitive function. Michael suggested that maybe I should talk to someone, get some professional help, consider medication to address what appeared to be anxiety and depression. His tone was so loving, so reasonable, so concerned that I almost believed him. Almost. But something about their coordinated response felt rehearsed. The way Ruth appeared at exactly the right moment with tea, the way Michael had clearly thought. Through his arguments, the way they both seemed so certain about what was wrong with me and what I needed to do about it. That night, lying in bed beside Michael, I tried to trace back through the last 8 months. When had the fog started? When had I begun feeling so compliant, so willing to let others make decisions for me? When had my sharp, analytical mind been replaced by this dreamy acceptance of professional decline? The answer came to me with horrible clarity. It had started right after Ruth moved in, right after she began making my morning smoothies, right after she took over meal preparation with such loving, careful attention to my preferences. The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that I tried to push it away immediately. Ruth was a grieving, injured woman who'd opened her heart to help our family. The idea that she might be deliberately harming me was paranoid, exactly the kind of thinking that proved Michael was right about my mental state. But once the suspicion took root, I couldn't stop it from growing. I began watching Ruth more carefully, noting how she always prepared my smoothie with her back turned, how she seemed unusually interested in whether I'd finished drinking it, how she'd grown more insistent about me eating the meals she prepared. I started an experiment. For 3 days, I pretended to drink my morning smoothie while actually pouring it down the sink when no one was looking. I ate foods I prepared myself and avoided anything Ruth had made. The difference was immediate and dramatic. My head cleared, my energy returned, and my natural assertiveness came flooding back like water through a broken dam. On the 4th morning, I got up earlier than usual and positioned myself where I could see into the kitchen without being noticed. What I witnessed confirmed my worst fears and shattered what remained of my trust in the people I loved most. Ruth stood at the counter with her back to the doorway, carefully crushing white tablets with the back of a spoon. She ground them into fine powder, then stirred the mixture into my smoothie with methodical precision. She tasted it, added more almond milk to mask any bitter flavor, then tasted again to ensure the medication was completely dissolved. I watched my mother-in-law drug my breakfast with the same careful attention she'd once brought to administering medications to hospital patients. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, systematic, and had been happening for months. I backed away from the kitchen doorway on shaking legs, my mind racing with implications. Ruth and Michael had been systematically drugging me, destroying my business, and convincing me it was all evidence of my own mental deterioration. They'd gaslit me so thoroughly that I'd almost believed I was losing my mind. But now I was awake. Now I understood. And now I was going to show them exactly how sharp and focused Rebecca Hayes could be when someone threatened everything she'd worked to build. The real me was back, and she was absolutely furious. I retreated to my bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs as the full scope of what I'd witnessed sank in. Ruth wasn't just some sweet, helpless widow who'd fallen on hard times. She was a trained medical professional who'd been using her knowledge to systematically poison me while wearing the mask of a loving caretaker. The precision with which she'd crushed those pills, the casual way she'd stirred them into my smoothie. The practiced ease of her movements suggested this wasn't a recent development, but a refined routine she'd perfected over months. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands as they trembled with rage and disbelief. Every morning for 8 months, I'd thanked Ruth for preparing my breakfast. I'd praised her thoughtfulness, appreciated her care, felt grateful for her presence in our home. Meanwhile, she'd been slowly erasing the woman I'd worked decades to become, turning me into a compliant shadow of myself while convincing everyone around me that my decline was natural, inevitable, even healthy. The cruelest part was how she'd made me complicit in my own destruction. She'd encouraged me to rest when I should have been working, to scale back when I should have been expanding, to trust others' judgment when my own instincts were screaming warnings I was too medicated to hear. She'd weaponized my own gratitude against me, using my appreciation for her help to mask the systematic dismantling of my career and independence. I needed evidence. Confronting Ruth and Michael with accusations based solely on what I'd witnessed would result in more gaslighting, more concerned discussions about my mental state, more suggestions that stress and paranoia were making me imagine elaborate conspiracies. I needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Moving quietly through the house, I made my way to the kitchen while Ruth was in the bathroom and Michael was still sleeping. The blender sat on the counter, recently rinsed but not yet cleaned thoroughly. I examined it under the overhead light, searching for any residue that might have been missed. At the bottom of the pitcher, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were tiny white specks that hadn't been completely washed away. Using a cotton swab from the first aid kit, I carefully collected samples of the residue and sealed them in a small plastic bag. I labeled it with the date and time, then hid it in my jewelry box where no one would think to look. It wasn't much, but it was something concrete, something real that couldn't be dismissed as imagination or stress-induced. Paranoia. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own home. I documented everything, taking photos of the pill residue I found in various glasses and cups, noting the times when Ruth prepared my food and drinks, recording how I felt on days when I avoided her offerings versus days when I pretended to consume them. The pattern was undeniable and horrifying. On days when I managed to avoid the drugged food entirely, my mind was sharp, my energy high, my natural assertiveness intact. I could think clearly about business strategies, analyze financial data with my usual precision, and remember details that had been slipping away for months. On days when I pretended to eat or drink items Ruth had prepared but actually disposed of them secretly, I felt like myself again, focused and capable and ready to tackle challenges. But on the few occasions when I actually consumed something Ruth had prepared, the fog would roll back in within an hour. My thoughts would become sluggish, my emotional responses muted, my drive and ambition replaced by a dreamy contentment that felt artificial and wrong. The contrast was so stark that I couldn't understand how I'd missed it for so long. I also began researching medications that could produce the symptoms I'd been experiencing. Late at night, when Ruth and Michael were asleep, I'd sit in my basement, office with my laptop, reading about anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Several classes of psychiatric medications, when administered to someone who didn't need them, could produce exactly the symptoms I'd experienced. Benzodiazepines could cause drowsiness, confusion, and memory problems. Antipsychotics could create emotional blunting and cognitive dulling. Mood stabilizers could reduce motivation and flatten personality. The medical literature was filled with case studies of people who'd been unknowingly drugged, their personalities and capabilities systematically suppressed by chemicals they never consented to take. The more I researched, the more I understood how carefully Ruth had planned this. As a retired nurse, she would have had access to medications, knowledge about dosing, and understanding of how different drugs would affect someone over time. She would have known exactly what to give me to make me compliant without making me obviously impaired. She'd turned me into a case study, a patient she was managing without my knowledge or consent. I also began to understand the timeline more clearly. Ruth's accident had happened in March, but her recovery had progressed much faster than anyone had expected. By May, she was walking without assistance and could have easily returned to her own apartment. But she'd chosen to stay, claiming she was still too weak, too afraid to live alone, too valuable as a helper to our household. The truth was that she'd found a situation she could control completely. Living with us, she had access to my food, my schedule, my daily routines. She could monitor my behavior, adjust dosages as needed, and observe the effects of her chemical management in real time. I wasn't a daughter-in-law she was helping during her recovery. I was a long-term project she was executing with scientific precision. Michael's role in this conspiracy was more complex and somehow more heartbreaking. I began watching him more carefully, noting when he made calls on my behalf, when he intercepted business communications, when he provided information about my condition to clients and colleagues. Some of his actions seemed genuinely motivated by concern, but others appeared calculated to isolate me professionally and socially. The morning I caught Ruth drugging my smoothie, I'd been too shocked to think clearly about what to do next. But as the days passed and I gathered more evidence, a plan began forming in my mind. I couldn't simply confront them and expect honest answers. I needed to involve someone with authority, someone who could validate what was happening and hold them accountable for their actions. I made an appointment with Dr. Jennifer Morrison, my physician, claiming I needed a routine physical. During the appointment, I explained that I'd been feeling unusually tired and unfocused for several months, wondering if there might be an underlying medical condition causing these symptoms. I asked for comprehensive blood work, including tests that would detect the presence of psychiatric medications. Dr. Morrison was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about my symptoms, my stress levels, my sleep patterns, and my overall health. When I mentioned that I'd been living with my mother-in-law since her accident and that she'd been helping with meal preparation, something in Dr. Morrison's expression shifted slightly. She ordered an extensive panel of blood tests, including several that seemed specifically designed to detect foreign substances. While waiting for the test results, I continued my documentation process. I photographed the pill residue I found in various containers, recorded detailed notes about my symptoms and their correlation with Ruth's food preparation, and researched the legal implications of what appeared to be systematic poisoning. What I discovered about the law was both encouraging and terrifying. Administering medication to someone without their knowledge or consent was considered assault and battery in Connecticut, regardless of the perpetrator's intentions. If the medication caused harm or impairment, additional charges could include reckless endangerment or even attempted murder, depending on the circumstances and the prosecutor's interpretation. But proving such charges would require clear evidence of intent, documentation of the medications used, and demonstration of harm caused. Simply finding drug residue in my system wouldn't be enough if Ruth and Michael claimed they'd been trying to help me, or that I'd been taking medication voluntarily and had forgotten due to stress or mental health issues. I needed more than blood tests. I needed witnesses, recordings, or other evidence that would establish a clear pattern of deception and harm. So I began setting traps. creating situations where Ruth's behavior would reveal her true intentions. The first test came when I mentioned to Ruth that I was considering seeing a therapist about my recent struggles with concentration and energy. I watched her face carefully as I explained that Dr. Morrison had suggested counseling might help with what appeared to be work-related stress and burnout. Ruth's reaction was immediate and telling. She became agitated, insisting that therapy was unnecessary, that I was obviously improving on my own, that bringing strangers into our family problems would only create more stress and complications. She suggested that I was being influenced by people who didn't understand our family dynamics, that outsiders couldn't possibly provide better guidance than the people who loved me most. Her response confirmed what I'd suspected. Ruth wasn't trying to help me get better. She was trying to prevent me from getting help that might expose what she was doing. A therapist might recognize the signs of chemical impairment, might ask questions about my symptoms that could lead to discovery of the drugging. Ruth needed me isolated from professional help, dependent on her care, and convinced that my problems were internal rather than external. I began testing Ruth in other ways, mentioning plans that would require me to be sharp and focused, suggesting business strategies that would demand my full cognitive abilities, expressing interest in activities that would take me away from the house for extended periods. Each time, Ruth would find subtle ways to discourage me, redirect my attention, or create obstacles that made following through more difficult. When I mentioned wanting to attend a weekend conference for financial planners, Ruth suddenly developed a series of health concerns that required my attention. When I suggested reaching out to former clients about potential contract work, she'd remind me of how overwhelmed I'd been lately, how important it was to recover fully before taking on new stressors. When I talked about wanting to exercise more regularly, she'd express worry about my pushing myself too hard when I was clearly still struggling with fatigue. Every suggestion I made that would improve my independence, increase my energy, or expand my professional network was met with loving concern that effectively sabotaged my plans. Ruth had become an expert at using my own guilt and gratitude against me, making me feel selfish for wanting things that might interfere with the family harmony she'd worked so hard to create. Michael's reactions to my suggestions were equally revealing, though more subtle. He would agree in principle with my ideas, but then raise practical concerns that made implementation difficult. When I wanted to attend the financial planning conference, he worried about the cost and whether I was really ready for that level of professional engagement. When I mentioned wanting to exercise more, he suggested that maybe I should wait until my energy levels were more stable. His objections always sounded reasonable, even supportive, but they consistently reinforced Ruth's message that I wasn't ready for independence, that I needed more time to recover, that pushing myself too hard might cause a relapse of whatever had been affecting me. Between the two of them, they'd created a perfect system of control disguised as care. The blood test results came back on a Thursday afternoon, and Dr. Morrison called me personally to discuss them. Her voice was carefully professional, but I could hear the concern underneath as she explained what they'd found. My blood contained significant levels of lorazepam and quetiapine, medications I'd never been prescribed and had never knowingly taken. The levels suggested regular ingestion over an extended period, consistent with daily dosing for several months. Dr. Morrison asked directly if I was taking these medications under the care of another physician, if I might have accidentally taken someone else's prescriptions, or if there was any other explanation for their presence in my system. I told her the truth. I explained about the pill residue I'd found, the dramatic improvement in my symptoms when I avoided Ruth's food preparation, and my growing suspicion that I was being drugged without my knowledge. Dr. Morrison listened, without interruption, asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes. When I finished explaining, Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. She told me that what I was describing sounded like a clear case of medication-facilitated abuse, a form of domestic violence that was more common than most people realized. She explained that I wasn't the first patient she'd treated who'd been unknowingly drugged by family members, and that my symptoms and their correlation with food consumption strongly supported my suspicions. Dr. Morrison recommended that I document everything I'd observed, avoid consuming any food or beverages prepared by Ruth, and consider involving law enforcement if I was certain about what was happening. She also suggested that I might want to consult with an attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases, as the legal implications of systematic drugging were serious and complex. For the first time in months, someone with professional authority was validating my experience instead of dismissing it. Dr. Morrison wasn't suggesting that I was paranoid or mentally unstable. She was confirming that what I suspected was not only possible, but consistent with patterns she'd seen before. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the anger that came with official confirmation of my worst fears. I left Dr. Morrison's office with copies of my blood test results and a referral to attorney Patricia Wells, a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases involving psychological and chemical abuse. I also had a clear understanding that what Ruth and Michael had done to me wasn't just morally wrong, it was criminal, and I had both the evidence and the legal standing to hold them accountable. But before I could move forward with any legal action, I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd done and why they'd done it. I needed to know how long this had been planned, whether Michael was a willing participant or Ruth's unwitting accomplice, and what their ultimate goals had been. Most importantly, I needed to make sure I had enough evidence to prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The woman they'd tried to erase with their chemical cocktail was back, and she was about to show them that some people don't stay buried, no matter how deep you try to dig their graves. Ruth had made one critical mistake in her careful campaign of control. She'd assumed that because she could suppress my personality with medications, she could also suppress my intelligence, my determination, and my ability to fight back when cornered. She'd underestimated the strength of the woman she was trying to destroy, and now she was about to learn exactly how dangerous that miscalculation could be. I spent the weekend creating a comprehensive timeline of events, correlating my symptoms with Ruth's food preparation, and organizing the evidence I'd collected into a clear, undeniable pattern of systematic abuse. I photographed every piece of physical evidence, made copies of all my medical records, and prepared a detailed written account of everything I'd observed and experienced. Monday morning, I called attorney Patricia Wells and scheduled an emergency consultation. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. It was time to show Ruth and Michael that the woman they'd tried to chemically lobotomize was still very much alive, and she was about to unleash the full force of the legal system on their carefully constructed lies. The real Rebecca Hayes was back, and she was ready for war. Attorney Patricia Wells had the kind of office that inspired confidence. Law books lined mahogany shelves from floor to ceiling, diplomas and professional awards covered one wall, and her massive desk commanded respect without being intimidating. At 55, Patricia had silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a neat chignon and intelligent green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail as I explained my situation. I'd spent hours preparing for this meeting, organizing my evidence into a clear presentation that would demonstrate the systematic nature of what Ruth and Michael had done to me. I brought copies of my blood test results, photographs of the pill residue I'd collected, my detailed timeline of symptoms and their correlation with Ruth's food preparation, and documentation of my business decline over the past 8 months. Patricia listened without interruption as I walked through each piece of evidence, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes on her legal pad. When I finished my presentation, she leaned back in her leather chair and studied me with an expression that was both sympathetic and professionally calculating. The first thing she told me was that what I'd experienced had a name in legal terminology. Medication-facilitated abuse was a recognized form of domestic violence that involved administering drugs to someone without their knowledge or consent in order to control their behavior, impair their judgment, or render them helpless. It was more common than most people realized, particularly in situations where the perpetrator had medical knowledge or access to prescription medications. Patricia explained that Ruth's background as a nurse made the case both stronger and more complex. On one hand, her medical training meant she would have known exactly what medications to use and how to administer them effectively. She would have understood the physiological effects of the drug she was giving me and could have calculated dosages that would impair me without causing obvious symptoms that might lead to discovery. On the other hand, Ruth's medical background also meant she could claim she was trying to help me, that she'd recognized signs of anxiety or depression, and had been providing what she believed to be appropriate treatment until I could see a doctor. The fact that she'd hidden her actions suggested malicious intent, but proving that in court would require demonstrating a pattern of deception and control rather than misguided care. Patricia asked detailed questions about my relationship with Ruth before her accident, looking for any signs of previous conflict or control issues that might establish a motive for her actions. I had to admit that Ruth and I had never been particularly close, that she'd always seemed somewhat disapproving of my career focus and lack of traditional domestic interests. But there hadn't been any overt conflicts or dramatic confrontations. This absence of obvious motive was actually typical in cases of medication-facilitated abuse, Patricia explained. Often the perpetrator was someone who felt their authority or importance was threatened by the victim's independence or success. Ruth might have seen my thriving business and strong marriage as evidence that her son didn't need her as much as she wanted to be needed. By creating a situation where I required constant care and support, she could position herself as indispensable, while reducing me to a more manageable version of myself. The business sabotage was particularly telling, Patricia noted. The systematic destruction of my client relationships, the interference with my professional communications, and the discouragement of networking opportunities all pointed to a deliberate campaign to isolate me and make me financially dependent on Michael's income. This wasn't random malice, but strategic manipulation designed to achieve specific goals. Patricia outlined the potential criminal charges that could be filed against Ruth and Michael. For Ruth, the primary charges would likely include assault and battery, since administering medication without consent constituted unlawful physical contact that caused harm. Depending on the specific medications used and the degree of impairment they caused, additional charges might include reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, or even attempted poisoning. Michael's culpability was more complicated since I hadn't directly witnessed him participating in the drugging. However, his interference with my business relationships, his misrepresentation of my condition to clients, and his apparent cooperation with Ruth's efforts to isolate me could support charges of conspiracy, fraud, or accessory after the fact. If prosecutors could prove he knew about the drugging and helped conceal it, his charges could be just as serious as Ruth's. Beyond the criminal implications, Patricia explained that I also had grounds for significant civil lawsuits against both Ruth and Michael. The business losses I'd suffered as a direct result of their actions could be calculated and claimed as damages. The medical expenses for ongoing treatment and monitoring could be recovered. Most importantly, the psychological trauma and intentional infliction of emotional distress could result in substantial compensatory and punitive damages. Patricia estimated that my business losses alone could exceed $200,000 when calculated over the 8 months of systematic sabotage. My client base, which had taken years to build, would require significant time and effort to rebuild. The damage to my professional reputation from missed deadlines and confused communications might have long-term effects that were difficult to quantify, but undeniably real. The most challenging aspect of pursuing legal action would be gathering additional evidence that could support the charges beyond reasonable doubt. While my blood test results and the physical evidence I'd collected were compelling, they represented only a snapshot of what had been happening. Prosecutors would want to see a more comprehensive pattern of behavior, preferably including direct evidence of Ruth's intent and Michael's knowledge. Patricia suggested several strategies for gathering additional evidence before we moved forward with any legal action. First, she recommended that I install a small recording device in the kitchen where I could capture Ruth preparing my food. Connecticut was a one-party consent state for audio recordings, which meant I could legally record conversations and activities in my own home without informing other parties. She also suggested that I might want to confront Ruth and Michael about what I'd discovered while wearing a wire, hoping to capture admissions of guilt or explanations of their motives. This approach was riskier since it would alert them to my knowledge and could prompt them to destroy evidence or change their behavior. But it might also result in recorded confessions that would be invaluable in court. Another possibility was conducting a controlled test, where I would pretend to consume drugged food or beverages while actually disposing of them. Then observe and record Ruth and Michael's reactions when I remained alert and focused instead of becoming drowsy and compliant. Their surprise or disappointment at my unexpected clarity might provide evidence of their expectations and intentions. Patricia also recommended that I undergo additional medical testing to establish the full scope of harm caused by the prolonged drugging. Certain psychiatric medications could have lasting effects on brain chemistry, liver function, or other body systems. Documenting these effects would strengthen both the criminal case and any civil lawsuit by demonstrating concrete physical harm beyond the psychological trauma. The timeline for legal action would depend partly on how much additional evidence we could gather and partly on the willingness of prosecutors to pursue criminal charges. Patricia had worked with the district attorney's office on similar cases and believed they would take medication-facilitated abuse seriously, particularly given the systematic nature of what Ruth had done and the clear documentation of harm. However, she warned me that legal proceedings could take months or even years to resolve completely. Criminal cases would take precedence over civil litigation, and both Ruth and Michael would likely hire their own attorneys who would challenge every aspect of our evidence and arguments. I needed to be prepared for a long, difficult fight that would require reliving the trauma repeatedly through depositions, hearings, and potentially a trial. Patricia also discussed the personal implications of pursuing legal action against my husband and mother-in-law. Even if we were completely successful in court, my marriage would almost certainly be destroyed. Michael might face jail time, loss of his teaching position, and permanent damage to his reputation. Ruth could face more serious criminal penalties, given her medical background and the premeditated nature of her actions. I would need to decide whether seeking justice was worth the personal cost of destroying my family relationships and potentially my marriage. Patricia emphasized that this was ultimately my choice to make, but she wanted me to understand the full implications before we moved forward. As our meeting concluded, Patricia provided me with a detailed plan for gathering additional evidence over the next 2 weeks. She gave me contact information for a private investigator who specialized in domestic abuse cases and could help with surveillance and evidence collection. She also referred me to a therapist who had experience working with victims of medication-facilitated abuse and could provide both emotional support and professional documentation of the psychological harm I'd suffered. Most importantly, Patricia assured me that what I'd experienced was real, serious, and legally actionable. Too many victims of this type of abuse were dismissed or disbelieved because the crime was so insidious, and the evidence could be easily destroyed or explained away. The fact that I'd recognized what was happening, gathered physical evidence, and sought professional help demonstrated both intelligence and courage that would serve me well in any legal proceedings. Leaving Patricia's office, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and dread. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was paranoid or mentally unstable, accepting other people's explanations for my declining capabilities. Now I had professional confirmation that my suspicions were not only valid, but likely understated. Ruth and Michael had committed serious crimes against me, and I had both the evidence and the legal standing to hold them accountable. But I also understood that pursuing justice would require destroying the life I'd built with Michael, exposing our family's secrets to public scrutiny, and potentially sending people I'd once loved to prison. The woman who'd been systematically drugged for 8 months might have been too impaired to make such difficult decisions. The woman I was becoming, with my natural sharpness and determination restored, was ready to make the hard choices necessary to protect herself and prevent this from happening to anyone else. I drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, seeing my neighborhood with new eyes. These tree-lined roads, well-maintained houses, and carefully tended gardens represented the life Michael and I had built together over 6 years of marriage. Everything looked peaceful and normal from the outside, just as our house had appeared to be a loving home where a caring family supported each other through difficult times. The reality was far darker. Behind the facade of domestic tranquility, a trained medical professional had been conducting an unauthorized psychological experiment on an unwilling subject. She'd used her knowledge and access to turn me into a case study, observing how psychiatric medications could be used to control behavior and suppress personality traits she found threatening or undesirable. Michael's role in this conspiracy was still partially unclear to me, but his cooperation was undeniable. Whether he'd been a willing participant from the beginning or had been gradually drawn into Ruth's manipulation, he'd ultimately chosen to protect her actions rather than protect me. He'd helped isolate me professionally, misrepresented my condition to others, and supported Ruth's narrative that I was mentally unstable rather than being deliberately impaired. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Ruth watching from the front window. Her expression was pleasant and welcoming, the same mask of caring concern she'd worn for months while systematically poisoning me. She probably assumed I'd been running errands or meeting with friends, never imagining that I'd spent the morning consulting with an attorney about criminal charges and civil lawsuits. I waved to her with a smile that felt genuine despite the anger burning in my chest. For the next 2 weeks, I would need to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed, that I remained the compliant, medicated version of myself that Ruth had worked so hard to create. I would need to be an actress in my own home, performing the role of the grateful, dependent woman while secretly gathering evidence that would expose the truth. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ruth had used deception and manipulation to control me for months. Now I would use deception and manipulation to gather the evidence necessary to stop her. The difference was that my deception served justice, while hers had served only her own psychological needs and desire for control. That evening, I sat at our dinner table sharing a meal Ruth had prepared, making pleasant conversation about my day while carefully avoiding anything she'd cooked. I complimented her pot roast and asked for the recipe, knowing I would never again eat anything that passed through her hands. I discussed my plans for the following day, mentioning errands and appointments that would give me opportunities to meet with the private investigator and install recording equipment. Michael seemed relaxed and affectionate, apparently believing that whatever crisis I'd been experiencing was resolving itself naturally. He talked about his classes, shared gossip from the school district, and made plans for the upcoming weekend. His normalcy felt obscene given what I now knew about his role in destroying my business and supporting Ruth's chemical manipulation. Ruth was particularly attentive, asking about my energy levels, commenting on how much better I seemed lately, encouraging me to continue taking things slowly and avoiding unnecessary stress. Her performance was masterful, conveying genuine care and concern while subtly reinforcing the narrative that I was fragile and needed careful management. After dinner, I excused myself to work in my basement office, claiming I wanted to organize some files and review client accounts. In reality, I spent the evening researching surveillance equipment, reviewing Patricia's instructions for evidence gathering, and planning my strategy for the next phase of this nightmare. I also began drafting a detailed account of everything I'd experienced, from the first symptoms of cognitive impairment to the moment I'd witnessed Ruth crushing pills into my smoothie. This written record would serve as evidence in any legal proceedings, but it was also therapeutic to document the full scope of what had been done to me. For months, I'd been questioning my own memories and perceptions. Writing everything down in chronological order helped me understand the systematic nature of the abuse and reinforced my determination to seek justice. The woman who went to bed that night was fundamentally different from the woman who'd been sleeping in that same bed for the past 8 months. The medicated, compliant Rebecca had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, and absolutely committed to exposing the truth. Ruth and Michael had awakened something in me that they probably wished had stayed buried. Tomorrow would begin the most dangerous phase of this ordeal. I would need to gather evidence while living among people who'd proven they were willing to drug me into submission to achieve their goals. I would need to maintain perfect control over my reactions and responses while documenting behavior that could send them to prison. But I was no longer the easy target they'd been manipulating for months. I was a woman who'd survived systematic chemical abuse, discovered the truth despite their efforts to keep me confused and compliant, and assembled the resources necessary to fight back. Ruth had made the mistake of assuming that suppressing my personality meant destroying my strength. She was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. The recording device Patricia's private investigator installed in our kitchen was smaller than a button, hidden inside the coffee maker where Ruth would never think to look. For 3 days, I went through the motions of normal life while the tiny microphone captured every conversation, every sound of pill crushing, every whispered discussion between Ruth and Michael about my condition and their plans for managing it. What the recordings revealed was far worse than I'd imagined. Ruth hadn't been acting alone or making impulsive decisions about my medication. She and Michael had been planning this systematically, discussing dosages like doctors reviewing a patient's treatment plan, analyzing my responses to determine whether they needed to increase or decrease the amounts they were giving me. On Tuesday morning, the device captured Ruth telling Michael that I seemed more alert lately, that perhaps they needed to adjust my breakfast preparation to ensure I remained stable. Michael's response chilled me to the bone. He suggested they might need to start adding medication to my dinner as well, since I appeared to be developing some resistance to the morning doses. They discussed my business decline with clinical detachment, noting how successfully they'd isolated me from professional contacts and reduced my client base to manageable levels. Ruth mentioned that my friend Sarah had called twice the previous week, wondering why I seemed so different lately. Michael suggested they might need to discourage that friendship more actively, perhaps by convincing me that Sarah was jealous of my newfound peace and work-life balance. The most damning recording came on Thursday evening, when Ruth and Michael thought I was asleep. I'd positioned myself at the top of the stairs where I could hear their conversation in the living room below, while the kitchen device captured their words with perfect clarity. Ruth explained to Michael that she'd researched the long-term effects of the medications she'd been giving me. With continued use, the cognitive impairment could become permanent, particularly if combined with social isolation and lack of mental stimulation. She suggested that perhaps this wouldn't be entirely unfortunate, since it would ensure I remained dependent on their care and guidance indefinitely. Michael's response revealed the depth of his betrayal. He admitted that he'd never been entirely comfortable with my business success, that having a wife who earned more money and commanded more professional respect than he did had always made him feel inadequate. Ruth's solution had given him the marriage he'd always wanted, with a wife who looked to him for guidance and support rather than challenging his authority or outshining his accomplishments. They discussed their long-term plans with horrifying casualness. Ruth would continue living with us indefinitely, monitoring my condition and adjusting my medication as needed. Michael would gradually take over all financial decisions and business relationships, positioning himself as my caretaker and protector. I would be allowed to maintain a small accounting practice, but only with clients they approved and under their supervision. The recording captured Ruth mentioning that she'd been researching guardianship laws, wondering if they might eventually be able to have me declared incompetent due to my apparent cognitive decline. With proper medical documentation and witness testimony about my deteriorating mental state, They could potentially gain legal control over my finances and medical decisions, making their manipulation permanent and legally protected. Listening to these conversations was like hearing my own eulogy delivered by the people who'd killed me. They spoke about the woman I'd been in past tense, as if my independence and professional success were problems they'd successfully solved. Rather than essential parts of my identity they'd criminally destroyed. They discussed my future as if I were a pet, whose behavior needed ongoing management, rather than a human being with rights and autonomy. But their casual cruelty also provided exactly the evidence Patricia needed to build an airtight case against them. The recordings demonstrated clear premeditation, ongoing conspiracy, and intent to cause long-term harm. Ruth's medical knowledge and deliberate dosing decisions would support charges of assault with a dangerous weapon. Michael's business, interference, and financial manipulation would support fraud and conspiracy charges. Friday morning, I called Patricia from my car while parked outside the grocery store, far from any listening devices Ruth or Michael might have installed. I played excerpts from the recordings over the phone, watching Patricia's expressions change, from professional interest to genuine shock as she heard the depth of their betrayal and the calculating nature of their plans. Patricia immediately contacted Detective Maria Santos with the Millbrook Police Department, a specialist in domestic violence cases who'd worked with medication-facilitated abuse before. Detective Santos agreed to meet with us that afternoon to review the evidence and discuss criminal charges. The police station felt like sanctuary after weeks of living with people who'd been systematically poisoning me. Detective Santos was a compact woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that inspired confidence. She listened to the recordings with growing anger, taking detailed notes and asking sharp questions about dates, dosages, and observable effects. Detective Santos explained that medication-facilitated abuse cases were particularly challenging because victims often didn't realize what was happening until significant harm had been done. The fact that I'd recognized the pattern, gathered physical evidence, and documented the systematic nature of the abuse made this one of the strongest cases she'd seen. Based on the evidence I'd provided, Detective Santos was prepared to seek arrest warrants for both Ruth and Michael immediately. Ruth would face charges of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Michael would face charges of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to assault. Depending on what additional evidence emerged during the investigation, more serious charges might be added. The detective explained the arrest process and what I could expect in the coming days. Ruth and Michael would be taken into custody, probably at our home, and transported to the station for booking and initial hearings. I would need to provide a detailed victim statement and would likely be called to testify before a grand jury if the case proceeded to trial. Patricia recommended that I not return home that evening, since the arrests would probably happen early Saturday morning, and the situation could become volatile. She helped me check into a hotel under an assumed name and arranged for a victim's advocate to stay with me during the arrest process. Saturday morning, I sat in my hotel room watching local news coverage of the arrests on television. The reporter described it as a shocking case of domestic abuse involving a retired nurse who'd allegedly drugged her daughter-in-law for months while systematically destroying her business. Michael was described as a high school teacher who'd allegedly conspired to isolate and control his wife through deception and financial manipulation. Seeing Ruth and Michael led away in handcuffs felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. These people who'd seemed so caring and concerned, who'd convinced me I was mentally unstable while they slowly poisoned me, were finally being held accountable for their crimes. The news coverage continued throughout the weekend as more details emerged about the case. Detective Santos had obtained search warrants for our house and Ruth's belongings, discovering a cache of psychiatric medications Ruth had somehow acquired, detailed notes about my daily routines and responses to different dosages, and evidence of the systematic sabotage of my business relationships. The story attracted national attention as an unusual case of medical abuse within a family setting. Domestic violence advocates praised the thoroughness of the investigation and the seriousness with which authorities had treated medication-facilitated abuse. Legal experts discussed the precedent the case might set for prosecuting family members who used medical knowledge to control and manipulate their relatives. Ruth's nursing background became a central focus of the coverage. State licensing boards announced investigations into how she'd obtained controlled substances without prescriptions and whether her actions warranted permanent revocation of her medical licenses. The hospital where she'd worked expressed shock and cooperated fully with authorities reviewing her employment records. Michael's school district placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Parents and colleagues expressed disbelief that someone they'd trusted with their children could be capable of such calculated cruelty toward his own wife. The contrast between his public persona as a caring educator and his private role in My D. Systematic abuse became a cautionary tale about hidden domestic violence. During the first week after the arrests, I moved back into our house with a security system and changed locks. Walking through rooms where I'd been systematically drugged felt like visiting a crime scene, which in many ways it was. I threw away every piece of kitchenware Ruth had used, every food item she might have contaminated, every medication bottle she'd touched. Sarah Chen visited me that first evening, bringing dinner and moral support. She'd been interviewed by police about her observations of my declining condition and had provided crucial testimony about the dramatic changes in my personality and capabilities over the past 8 months. Seeing her reminded me of the friendships I'd nearly lost due to Ruth and Michael's interference, relationships I was determined to rebuild now that my mind was clear again. The legal proceedings moved forward with remarkable speed. Ruth and Michael were denied bail due to flight risk and the ongoing danger they posed to my safety. Both hired experienced criminal defense attorneys who immediately began challenging the evidence and arguing that their clients had been trying to help me rather than harm me. Ruth's attorney claimed she'd been providing compassionate care to a daughter-in-law who was clearly suffering from undiagnosed mental health issues. He argued that her nursing background had helped her recognize symptoms I was unable to acknowledge myself, and that her actions had been motivated by genuine concern rather than malicious intent. Michael's attorney took a different approach, claiming his client had been manipulated by his mother and had genuinely believed I was experiencing a mental health crisis. He portrayed Michael as another victim of Ruth's manipulation, someone who'd been convinced to participate in what he thought was a medical intervention rather than a criminal conspiracy. Patricia and the prosecution team systematically dismantled these defense strategies. The recordings clearly demonstrated premeditation and ongoing conspiracy rather than emergency medical intervention. The business sabotage showed intent to cause financial harm beyond any reasonable medical treatment. Most damaging, Ruth's research into guardianship laws revealed long-term plans for permanent control rather than temporary assistance. The grand jury hearings took place 6 weeks after the arrests. I testified for nearly 4 hours, walking through the timeline of my symptoms, the discovery of the drugging, and the systematic destruction of my professional life. The grand jurors asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated their understanding of the serious nature of the crimes committed against me. Both Ruth and Michael were indicted on multiple felony charges. Ruth faced 15 years in prison if convicted on all counts. Michael faced 10 years, though his attorney was already discussing plea bargain possibilities that might reduce his sentence in exchange for cooperation and testimony against Ruth. The civil lawsuit Patricia filed on my behalf sought damages for medical expenses, business losses, emotional distress, and punitive damages designed to deter similar crimes. She estimated the total value of my losses at over $400,000, not including the ongoing therapy and medical monitoring I would need to address the long-term effects of prolonged drugging. 3 months after the arrests, Michael accepted a plea bargain that required him to serve 18 months in prison, pay restitution for my business losses, and undergo mandatory psychological counseling. In exchange, he agreed to testify against Ruth and provide detailed information about her planning and execution of the drugging scheme. Ruth's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Her attorney continued to claim she'd been providing medical care rather than committing assault, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The recordings, the physical evidence, the testimony from medical experts about the dangers of unauthorized medication administration, and Michael's cooperation painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. During the months of legal proceedings, I worked to rebuild both my business and my sense of self. The cognitive effects of prolonged drugging gradually faded as the medications cleared from my system, but the psychological impact would take longer to heal. I started therapy with Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in trauma recovery, who helped me process the betrayal and manipulation I'd experienced. Rebuilding my client base required patience and persistence. Many former clients were willing to work with me again once they understood what had happened, though some relationships had been permanently damaged by the confusion and missed deadlines during my impaired months. I focused on providing exceptional service to the clients who trusted me with their business, gradually rebuilding my reputation and financial stability. The most difficult part of recovery was accepting that the marriage I'd treasured had been built on lies and manipulation. Michael's willingness to participate in systematically drugging me revealed a character I'd never suspected he possessed. Even if he'd been manipulated by Ruth, his decision to prioritize his ego over my safety and autonomy was unforgivable. I filed for divorce while Michael was in prison, citing irreconcilable differences and domestic abuse. The proceedings were straightforward since Michael didn't contest the divorce or fight for any assets. Our house was sold, and the proceeds split according to our prenuptial agreement. I used my portion to buy a smaller home across town, far from the memories of deception and betrayal. Ruth's trial finally began in March, nearly a year after the arrests. The prosecution presented a methodical case demonstrating her medical knowledge, her access to controlled substances, her systematic administration of psychiatric medications without consent, and her long-term plans for maintaining control over my life and finances. The defense continued to argue that Ruth had been providing compassionate medical care, but this narrative collapsed under cross-examination. Expert witnesses testified that no legitimate medical intervention would involve secret medication administration, systematic isolation from professional support, or research into guardianship laws for someone who hadn't been diagnosed with any cognitive impairment. My testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. I described the gradual loss of my mental faculties, the confusion and compliance that had replaced my natural assertiveness, and the systematic destruction of relationships and professional achievements I'd spent years building. The jury listened with visible shock as I explained how Ruth had turned my gratitude for her help into a weapon against my own independence. The most powerful moment came when prosecutors played the recordings of Ruth and Michael discussing their plans for my permanent incapacitation. Hearing Ruth's voice calmly discussing the long-term cognitive damage she hoped to achieve, delivered in the same caring tone she'd used when bringing me breakfast, demonstrated the calculated cruelty behind her maternal facade. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Ruth was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 8 years. The judge noted that her abuse of medical knowledge and violation of trust warranted the maximum sentence allowed under law. The civil lawsuit was resolved through a settlement that awarded me damages covering my business losses, medical expenses, and compensation for emotional distress. Ruth's pension and assets were seized to pay the judgment, ensuring she would have no financial resources to continue manipulating others after her eventual release from prison. Standing outside the courthouse after Ruth's sentencing, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous. My marriage was destroyed, my trust in others permanently altered, and my sense of safety in my own home shattered in ways that might never fully heal. But I had survived. I had recognized what was happening to me, gathered evidence despite being chemically impaired, and held my abusers accountable for their crimes. The woman Ruth had tried to erase with psychiatric medications was not only still alive, but stronger for having fought back against systematic abuse. My accounting practice was thriving again, with a client base that appreciated both my professional skills and my resilience in overcoming personal challenges. I'd become an advocate for victims of medication-facilitated abuse, working with domestic violence organizations to educate people about this hidden form of family violence. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my instincts again. When something feels wrong, when your mind isn't working the way it should, when people who claim to love you are making decisions that benefit them more than you, those feelings deserve investigation rather than dismissal. Sometimes the people closest to us are the most dangerous, and survival requires the courage to look beyond their caring facades to see their true intentions. Ruth and Michael had tried to steal my life, my identity, and my future. They'd come closer to succeeding than I like to remember. But in the end, they'd underestimated the strength of the woman they were trying to destroy. Some people don't stay buried, no matter how deep you try to dig their graves. The real Rebecca Hayes was back for good, and she was never again going to let anyone else control her story. The small recording device I'd hidden in my jewelry box had been running for 6 days when it captured the conversation that would seal Ruth and Michael's fate forever. I'd placed it there after noticing they sometimes had private discussions in our bedroom when they thought I was napping, believing the medication had made me sleep so deeply that nothing could wake me. What the device recorded was Ruth coaching Michael on how to respond when authorities eventually questioned him about my condition. She was teaching him medical terminology to describe my supposed symptoms, rehearsing explanations for why they'd had to take control of my business affairs, and discussing how to present their actions as loving intervention rather than systematic abuse. Ruth's voice was calm and instructional as she explained to Michael how psychiatric medications could cause memory problems, making it unlikely that I would be able to provide coherent testimony about what had happened to me. She suggested that, even if I did remember being drugged, my credibility would be compromised by the very medication she'd been giving me, creating what she called perfect legal protection. The recording captured Ruth describing her research into how long various psychiatric drugs remained detectable in blood and urine tests. She'd calculated that if they stopped medicating me immediately, most traces would be gone within 2 weeks, leaving only my word against theirs about what had occurred. She seemed proud of her scientific approach to covering up the evidence of her crimes. Most damning was Ruth's admission that she'd been documenting my responses to different medications in a notebook she kept hidden in her bedroom. She told Michael that her detailed records would help them maintain consistency in their story about my mental health decline, providing specific dates and symptoms they could reference if questioned by doctors or authorities. This revelation sent me into detective mode. While Ruth and Michael were out grocery shopping the next morning, I searched their bedroom methodically, looking for the notebook she'd mentioned. I found it wedged between her mattress and box spring, a composition book filled with detailed entries about dosages, timing, and my behavioral responses to various combinations of psychiatric medications. Reading Ruth's notes was like discovering the field journal of a scientist studying an experimental subject. She'd recorded everything from how long it took different medications to take effect to which combinations made me most compliant during business discussions. She'd noted that increasing the morning dose made me less likely to question Michael's interference with my client relationships, while adding evening medication prevented me from staying alert enough to work on business. Planning after dinner. The notebook contained calculations about my body weight and metabolism, research she'd copied from medical journals about drug interactions, and observations about which personality changes were most beneficial for their control over my life. She'd even drawn charts tracking my professional decline, noting with satisfaction when each client relationship ended and attributing the losses to her successful medication management. Ruth had documented her methods for acquiring the psychiatric drugs she'd been giving me. Some came from her own leftover prescriptions from after Frank's death, when a doctor had given her anti-anxiety medication for grief. Others she'd obtained by claiming she was caring for an elderly relative who needed medication but couldn't get to the doctor. A few she'd simply stolen from the hospital where she'd worked, taking advantage of her access during her final weeks before retirement. The notebook revealed that Ruth had been planning this systematic drugging for months before putting it into action. She'd begun researching psychiatric medications and their effects within weeks of Frank's funeral, apparently seeing my independence and success as problems that needed to be solved rather than qualities that should be celebrated. She'd studied my routines, learned my preferences, and prepared her strategy with the thoroughness of a military campaign. Most chilling were her observations about the psychological effects of the medications on my personality and decision-making abilities. Ruth had noted with clinical detachment how the drugs made me more agreeable during conflicts, less likely to challenge Michael's authority, and increasingly dependent on both of them for guidance and support. She'd treated my transformation from an independent professional to a compliant dependent as a successful medical intervention rather than a criminal assault. I photographed every page of Ruth's notebook with my phone, creating a complete digital record of her systematic documentation of drugging me. This evidence was even more valuable than the audio recordings because it showed premeditation, careful planning, and ongoing monitoring of the harm she was causing me. No defense attorney could argue that this level of documentation represented spontaneous concern for my welfare. Armed with this devastating evidence, I called Patricia Wells immediately. She instructed me to leave the house with the notebook and meet her at the police station, where Detective Santos was waiting to review what I'd discovered. The three of us spent hours going through Ruth's entries, with Detective Santos becoming visibly angrier as she read each calculated notation about my declining capabilities and increasing dependence. Detective Santos explained that Ruth's notebook represented the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about in domestic abuse cases. The detailed documentation of illegal drug administration, the systematic tracking of harmful effects, and the clear demonstration of intent to cause long-term impairment would make conviction virtually certain on multiple felony charges. Patricia pointed out that the notebook also provided crucial evidence for the civil lawsuit we would file, seeking damages for the systematic destruction of my business and personal life. Ruth's own words demonstrated that she'd deliberately targeted my professional relationships and cognitive abilities, making it impossible for her to claim her actions had been motivated by medical concern rather than malicious control. The medical experts Patricia consulted were horrified by Ruth's systematic approach to medicating me without consent. Dr. Jennifer Kim, a psychiatrist who specialized in medication-assisted abuse, explained that Ruth's combination of drugs and dosages could have caused permanent brain damage if continued long-term. The fact that she'd been monitoring and adjusting the medications based on my responses showed a level of premeditation that elevated her crimes from impulsive abuse to calculated assault. Detective Santos moved quickly to obtain additional search warrants based on the notebook evidence. When police searched Ruth's belongings more thoroughly, they discovered not only the remaining psychiatric medications she'd been using to drug me, but also research materials about guardianship laws, disability, determinations, and legal procedures for having someone declared mentally incompetent. Ruth had been planning to have me legally declared unable to manage my own affairs, using the cognitive impairment she'd artificially created as evidence that I needed a court-appointed guardian. The paperwork she'd prepared suggested she intended Michael to become my legal guardian, giving them permanent control over my finances, medical decisions, and personal life. This discovery added new charges to the case against both Ruth and Michael. Conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted exploitation of a disabled person, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights were added to the existing assault and battery charges. Ruth was now facing the possibility of 25 years in prison if convicted on all counts. Michael's attorney immediately began negotiating a plea bargain when faced with the notebook evidence and the additional charges. The documentation clearly showed that Michael had known about Ruth's systematic drugging and had actively participated in the conspiracy to control my life and finances. His cooperation with Ruth's plan to have me declared incompetent demonstrated intent to cause permanent harm, rather than temporary assistance. The plea negotiations revealed the full extent of Michael's betrayal. He admitted to prosecutors that he'd been uncomfortable with my business success from early in our marriage, feeling emasculated by having a wife who earned more money and commanded more professional respect than he did. When Ruth suggested her medication solution, he'd seen it as an opportunity to create the kind of marriage he'd always wanted, with a wife who looked to him for guidance rather than challenging his authority. Michael's confession included details about how they'd coordinated their efforts to isolate me from professional contacts and supportive relationships. He'd actively discouraged my friendships with successful women, claiming they were bad influences who made me dissatisfied with our life together. He'd sabotaged business opportunities by providing negative information about my availability and reliability to potential clients. The psychological evaluation ordered as part of Michael's plea bargain revealed a personality profile that shocked even the experienced forensic psychologist who conducted it. Michael scored high on measures of narcissism, entitlement, and need for control, while showing little genuine remorse for the harm he'd caused me. The psychologist concluded that Michael's actions had been motivated primarily by his own insecurity and desire for dominance, rather than any real concern for my well-being. Ruth's psychological evaluation painted an even more disturbing picture. She showed characteristics of severe narcissistic personality disorder, combined with what the evaluator termed medical sadism, a pattern of using medical knowledge to harm others while maintaining a facade of caregiving. The psychologist concluded that Ruth had derived psychological satisfaction from systematically dismantling my independence and professional success. As the legal proceedings moved forward, I began the difficult process of rebuilding my life and recovering from the trauma of systematic abuse. The cognitive effects of prolonged psychiatric medication were gradually clearing, but the psychological impact of betrayal by the people closest to me was more complex and long-lasting. Dr. Amanda Foster, the trauma specialist I'd begun seeing, helped me understand that what I'd experienced was a form of intimate partner violence that was particularly insidious because it involved chemical manipulation of my brain chemistry. The fact that I'd recognized what was happening and gathered evidence despite being impaired demonstrated remarkable strength and intelligence, but the recovery process would still require time and professional support. One of the most challenging aspects of recovery was learning to trust my own perceptions again. Months of being told that my concerns were paranoid or that my declining abilities were due to mental illness had undermined my confidence in my own judgment. Dr. Foster worked with me to rebuild that trust, helping me distinguish between legitimate concerns and anxiety-driven overthinking. I also had to confront the reality that my marriage had been built on lies and manipulation from the beginning. Michael's admission that he'd been uncomfortable with my success revealed that he'd never truly supported my professional ambitions or valued my independence. The man I'd thought I married had been a carefully constructed facade designed to win my trust so he could eventually control me. The financial recovery was somewhat easier to navigate than the emotional healing. Patricia's civil lawsuit against Ruth and Michael sought comprehensive damages for my business losses, medical expenses, and pain and suffering. The detailed documentation Ruth had kept of her systematic abuse actually helped establish the full scope of financial harm her actions had caused. My accounting practice began to recover as word spread about what had happened to me. Many clients who'd been concerned about my changing behavior during the months I was being drugged now understood what had caused my professional difficulties. Some even increased their business with me out of admiration for my strength in exposing and surviving systematic abuse. The media attention surrounding the case brought both opportunities and challenges. I received speaking invitations from domestic violence organizations, medical associations, and legal groups interested in learning about medication-facilitated abuse. While reliving my experience publicly was emotionally difficult, I felt obligated to educate others about this hidden form of family violence. Dr. Kim, the psychiatrist who'd reviewed Ruth's notebook, invited me to co-author an article about medication-facilitated abuse for a medical journal. Our research revealed that this type of abuse was more common than previously recognized, particularly in families where one person had medical knowledge or access to prescription drugs. Many victims never realized they were being drugged, attributing their symptoms to stress, aging, or natural mental health changes. Ruth's trial began 18 months after her arrest, with media coverage that attracted national attention to the case. The prosecution presented a methodical demonstration of her systematic abuse, using her own notebook entries to show the premeditated and ongoing nature of her crimes. The evidence was so overwhelming that Ruth's defense attorney focused primarily on seeking a reduced sentence rather than arguing innocence. My testimony at Ruth's trial was both emotionally exhausting and therapeutically valuable, describing the systematic erosion of my cognitive abilities, the confusion and helplessness I'd felt, and the gradual destruction of my professional life helped me process the full scope of what had been done to me. The jury's visible shock and anger as I explained Ruth's methods validated my experience and reinforced that what had happened to me was serious and criminal. The defense's attempt to portray Ruth as a concerned family member who'd made poor decisions while trying to help me fell apart under cross-examination. Ruth's own notebook entries, read aloud in court, demonstrated calculated cruelty rather than misguided care. Her research into permanent guardianship and disability determinations showed long-term planning for my complete subjugation rather than temporary medical intervention. Ruth's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for me to deliver a victim impact statement that fully expressed the harm she'd caused. I described not only the financial and professional losses, but also the psychological trauma of discovering that someone I'd trusted had been systematically poisoning me while pretending to care about my welfare. The judge sentenced Ruth to 18 years in prison, noting that her abuse of medical knowledge and systematic betrayal of trust warranted the maximum penalty allowed under law. The sentence included a requirement that Ruth pay full restitution for my business losses and medical expenses, though her limited assets meant I would likely never recover the full amount of damages awarded. Michael's sentencing was scheduled for the following month. His plea bargain required him to serve 4 years in prison, undergo mandatory psychological counseling, and pay his share of restitution for the financial harm caused by their conspiracy. While his sentence was lighter than Ruth's due to his cooperation, it still reflected the serious nature of his betrayal and active participation in systematic abuse. The civil lawsuit was resolved through a settlement that awarded me damages, covering my business losses, medical expenses, ongoing therapy costs, and compensation for pain and suffering. While no amount of money could fully compensate for what I'd endured, the financial settlement provided security and recognition of the serious harm Ruth and Michael had caused. 3 years after the nightmare began, I had rebuilt both my business and my sense of self. My client base was larger than it had ever been, staffed by professionals who respected my expertise and resilience. I'd purchased a new home in a different part of town, far from the memories of systematic abuse and betrayal. The experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I was more cautious about trusting others, more alert to signs of manipulation and control, and more protective of my independence and professional autonomy. While these changes represented necessary growth rather than paranoia, they also reminded me daily of what I'd survived and overcome. My work as an advocate for victims of medication-facilitated abuse became an important part of my new identity. I consulted with law enforcement agencies training officers to recognize this type of domestic violence, testified as an expert witness in similar cases, and worked with medical professionals to develop protocols for identifying patients who might be victims of systematic drugging. The most rewarding aspect of my advocacy work was helping other victims recognize what was happening to them and find the courage to seek help. I'd received dozens of calls and emails from people who recognized their own experiences in my story, many of whom had been dismissed by family members and professionals who didn't understand the subtle nature of medication-facilitated abuse. Standing in my new office 5 years after Ruth's conviction, surrounded by the success I'd rebuilt from the ashes of systematic abuse, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who'd been gradually erased by psychiatric medications had not only survived, but emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined to help others avoid similar victimization. Ruth and Michael had tried to steal my life, my identity, and my future. They'd come closer to succeeding than I liked to remember, using medical knowledge and emotional manipulation to turn me into a shadow of my former self. But they'd underestimated the strength of the human spirit and the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. The real Rebecca Hayes was not only back, but better than ever, armed with knowledge, experience, and an unshakable determination never again to let anyone else control her story. Some battles leave scars, but they also leave survivors who are strong enough to help others fight their own wars for freedom and dignity. The phone call came at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, 6 months after Ruth's sentencing. Detective Santos's voice was tense as she explained that Ruth had been found dead in her prison cell, apparently from complications related to a stroke she'd suffered during the night. My first reaction was a complicated mixture of relief and unexpected sadness, followed immediately by concern about what Ruth's death might mean for the ongoing civil proceedings and my own safety. Patricia Wells arrived at my office within 2 hours of the call, bringing both legal updates and surprising news about discoveries made during the investigation into Ruth's death. Prison officials had found additional notebooks hidden in Ruth's cell containing detailed plans for what she intended to do after her release. The notebooks revealed that Ruth had been using her time in prison to refine her methods, researching new medications and techniques for controlling people without their knowledge. The most disturbing discovery was Ruth's correspondence with other inmates who had medical backgrounds. She'd been sharing her knowledge about medication-facilitated abuse, teaching others how to systematically drug family members and romantic partners to maintain control over their behavior and decisions. Prison officials found evidence that Ruth had been planning to establish what she called a consulting service for people who wanted to manage difficult relatives or spouses. Ruth's prison notebooks also contained detailed fantasies about revenge against me for exposing her crimes. She'd been researching my new address, my business relationships, and my daily routines through information she somehow obtained from contacts outside the prison. Her notes included plans for how she might continue her systematic abuse remotely, using accomplices to administer medications or create other forms of ongoing harassment. Detective Santos explained that Ruth's death had likely prevented what could have been a dangerous escalation of her obsession with controlling and punishing me. The prison correspondence and hidden notebooks suggested that Ruth had never accepted responsibility for her crimes or understood that her actions constituted serious abuse rather than appropriate caregiving. Her death had ended a threat I hadn't even realized still existed. The investigation into Ruth's prison activities led to additional discoveries that horrified both law enforcement and medical professionals. Ruth had been conducting what amounted to a correspondence course in domestic abuse, teaching others how to use medical knowledge to control family members without detection. Several of her prison pen pals were investigated and found to be engaging in similar abuse patterns in their own families. Patricia filed additional motions to ensure that Ruth's estate would still be liable for the civil damages awarded in my lawsuit, despite her death. The legal proceedings were complicated by Ruth's passing, but her documented admission of guilt in the prison notebooks actually strengthened the case for recovering damages from her remaining assets. Michael's parole hearing was scheduled for the following month, after serving 3 years of his 4-year sentence. His prison counselors reported that he'd made significant progress in understanding the harm he'd caused and accepting responsibility for his role in the systematic abuse. However, his psychological evaluations still showed concerning patterns of entitlement and need for control that worried both his therapists and parole officials. I was invited to provide a victim impact statement for Michael's parole hearing, an opportunity to express my views about his potential release and any conditions that should be imposed to protect my safety. The prospect of Michael returning to the community where I lived and worked created anxiety I thought I'd overcome, reminding me that recovery from systematic abuse was an ongoing process rather than a destination. Dr. Foster helped me prepare for the parole hearing by working through my feelings about potentially encountering Michael in public settings. We discussed practical safety measures as well as emotional coping strategies for dealing with the stress of knowing my former abuser was free and living nearby. The work reminded me that healing from betrayal trauma required ongoing attention and self-care. The parole hearing itself was both emotionally challenging and unexpectedly empowering. I delivered a detailed victim impact statement describing the long-term effects of Michael and Ruth's systematic abuse, including ongoing trust issues, hypervigilance about my food and drink, and persistent anxiety about my safety and independence. I also described the positive changes I'd made in rebuilding my life and career despite the trauma they'd inflicted. Michael's statement to the parole board was carefully prepared and delivered with apparent sincerity. He expressed remorse for his actions, acknowledged the serious harm he'd caused, and described the therapy work he'd done to understand his motivations and develop healthier relationship patterns. His words sounded genuine, but I found myself analyzing his tone and body language for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize. The parole board questioned Michael extensively about his plans for reintegration into the community, his understanding of the restraining order that prohibited him from contacting me, and his commitment to continuing therapy after release. They seemed particularly concerned about his employment prospects, since his teaching license had been permanently revoked following his conviction. Michael was granted parole with strict conditions that included ongoing psychological counseling, regular check-ins with a parole officer, complete prohibition on contact with me or my family, and restrictions on his access to medications and medical facilities. He was also required to notify authorities if he began any romantic relationship, ensuring that potential partners would be aware of his history of domestic abuse. The months following Michael's release were tense despite the legal protections in place. I found myself constantly alert for signs of his presence in my daily life, checking for familiar cars in parking lots and scanning crowds for his face. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but felt necessary for maintaining my sense of safety and control. My business continued to thrive during this period, partly because the media attention surrounding the case had attracted clients who admired my resilience and professional expertise. I'd developed a specialty in helping small businesses recover from financial crises and fraud, drawing on my own experience of rebuilding after systematic destruction. The irony wasn't lost on me that the skills I'd developed surviving abuse had become valuable professional assets. The speaking engagements and advocacy work I'd begun during the legal proceedings evolved into a significant part of my professional identity. I consulted with domestic violence organizations, medical associations, and law enforcement agencies about recognizing and responding to medication-facilitated abuse. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply meaningful, helping prevent others from experiencing what I'd survived. One of the most rewarding aspects of my advocacy work was mentoring other survivors of systematic abuse. I'd developed a support network for people recovering from various forms of intimate partner violence, with particular focus on cases involving medical manipulation or financial exploitation. The group met monthly in a community center conference room, providing both practical resources and emotional support for members at different stages of recovery. Through this support group, I met Maria Santos, a woman whose story paralleled mine in disturbing ways. Maria's ex-husband had been systematically drugging her with sleep medications while gradually taking control of her successful restaurant business. Like me, she'd initially attributed her declining cognitive abilities to stress and overwork, not realizing she was being chemically impaired by someone she trusted. Maria's case was still working its way through the legal system when we met, and I was able to provide both emotional support and practical advice about evidence gathering and working with prosecutors. Her eventual conviction of her ex-husband for medication-facilitated abuse helped establish additional legal precedents that strengthened protections for other victims. The support group also included survivors of financial abuse, psychological manipulation, and various forms of coercive control. While the specific methods varied, the underlying patterns were remarkably similar across cases. Abusers typically targeted successful independent people whose achievements threatened their need for control. They used gradual manipulation techniques that isolated victims from support systems while slowly eroding their confidence and decision-making abilities. Working with other survivors helped me understand that my experience, while uniquely involving systematic drugging, was part of a broader pattern of intimate partner violence that affected people across all demographics and backgrounds. The shame and self-doubt I'd experienced were common responses to betrayal trauma, not personal weaknesses or failures on my part. 5 years after Ruth's death and Michael's release, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Patricia's law office. The letter was from Michael, requesting permission to meet with me as part of his ongoing therapy work. His therapist had apparently suggested that making direct amends to his victims might be beneficial for his rehabilitation, though the request would require my consent and could only happen under strict supervision. My initial reaction was immediate and emphatic refusal. The idea of sitting in a room with Michael, even with legal protections and therapeutic supervision, triggered anxiety that surprised me with its intensity. I'd thought I'd moved beyond allowing him to affect my emotional state, but the mere possibility of direct contact brought back memories of confusion and helplessness I'd worked hard to overcome. Dr. Foster and I spent several sessions exploring my feelings about Michael's request and what it might mean for my continued healing. She emphasized that I had no obligation to facilitate his rehabilitation or provide him with opportunities for redemption. My primary responsibility was protecting my own well-being and continuing my recovery process. After careful consideration, I decided to decline Michael's request for a meeting, but agreed to provide a written response through our attorneys. In my letter, I explained that while I appreciated his reported progress in therapy, I had no desire for direct contact or involvement in his rehabilitation process. I emphasized that my recovery required maintaining clear boundaries and that his best contribution to my healing would be respecting my need for complete separation. Michael's response to my letter, also transmitted through legal channels, was brief and respectful. He acknowledged my right to refuse contact, expressed continued remorse for his actions, and promised to honor my boundaries indefinitely. While I couldn't know whether his contrition was genuine, his willingness to accept my refusal without argument seemed consistent with genuine rehabilitation rather than continued manipulation. The 7th anniversary of discovering Ruth's systematic drugging arrived on a bright spring morning that reminded me of the day I'd first witnessed her crushing pills into my smoothie. Instead of anniversary dread, I felt a sense of accomplishment and gratitude for how far I'd traveled from that moment of horrifying realization to my current life of independence and purpose. My accounting practice had expanded beyond what it had been before the abuse, with a team of 3 associate accountants and a specialty practice in helping businesses recover from fraud and financial exploitation. The expertise I'd developed through surviving systematic abuse had become a valuable professional asset, allowing me to help other business owners recognize and recover from various forms of financial manipulation. The advocacy work had evolved into a formal nonprofit organization dedicated to education and support for victims of medication-facilitated abuse. We'd successfully lobbied for stronger legal protections and mandatory training for healthcare providers about recognizing signs of systematic drugging. The organization had helped dozens of victims gather evidence, navigate legal proceedings, and rebuild their lives after discovering they'd been systematically abused. My home had become a sanctuary that reflected my authentic preferences. than accommodating anyone else's needs or expectations. Every piece of furniture, every color choice, every decorative element had been selected based solely on what brought me joy and comfort. The space felt like a physical manifestation of the independence and self-determination I'd fought so hard to reclaim. The relationships in my life were built on genuine mutual respect and support, rather than obligation or manipulation. I'd reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the months of systematic drugging, and I'd formed new friendships with people who valued my strength and authenticity. While I remained cautious about romantic relationships, I'd begun dating occasionally, always maintaining clear boundaries and trusting my instincts about people's motivations. The financial security I'd rebuilt exceeded what I'd achieved before the abuse, partly through the success of my expanded business, and partly through careful investment of the settlement funds from the civil lawsuit. More importantly, I'd developed a much more sophisticated understanding of financial independence as a form of personal security that couldn't be taken away by others' manipulation or control. The therapeutic work I'd done with Dr. Foster had equipped me with tools for recognizing manipulation, maintaining healthy boundaries, and trusting my own perceptions even when others questioned them. While I would always carry some scars from the systematic betrayal I'd experienced, those scars had become sources of strength rather than vulnerability. The most profound change was in my relationship with trust itself. Rather than becoming paranoid or unable to form close relationships, I'd learned to trust more intelligently, paying attention to actions rather than words, observing consistency over time, and maintaining my independence even within close relationships. I'd discovered that healthy trust was earned gradually through demonstrated reliability rather than granted automatically based on roles or proclamations of love. On quiet evenings in my home, preparing meals I'd chosen and prepared myself, I sometimes reflected on the woman I'd been before Ruth's systematic abuse began. That woman had been successful and independent, but perhaps naive about the depths of cruelty that could hide behind caring facades. The woman I'd become was successful and independent, but also wise about human nature and uncompromising about protecting her autonomy. Ruth and Michael had tried to erase me, to replace my authentic self with a compliant, controlled version that served their psychological needs. Their failure to succeed permanently had cost them their freedom, their reputations, and ultimately their lives as they'd known them. My survival and recovery had proven that some people's essential selves are too strong to be chemically suppressed, too resilient to be permanently broken by systematic abuse. The story of my systematic drugging and recovery had been featured in documentaries, academic papers, and training materials for professionals working with domestic violence victims. While reliving the experience publicly was sometimes emotionally challenging, sharing my story had helped countless others recognize their own victimization and find the courage to seek help. 10 years after that first morning when I found pill residue in my coffee mug, I stood in my office looking out at the town where I'd rebuilt my life from the ashes of systematic betrayal. The woman in the reflection was older, wiser, and infinitely stronger than the person who'd once thanked her mother-in-law for preparing breakfast while being slowly poisoned. Ruth Hayes had died in prison. Her dreams of controlling and manipulating others ended permanently. Michael Hayes had served his time and was reportedly building a new life far from our shared community, hopefully with the self-awareness necessary to avoid repeating his crimes. Both of them had learned, through legal consequences they couldn't manipulate or escape, that some people refuse to stay buried no matter how systematically others try to destroy them. The real Rebecca Hayes was not only back, but better than ever, armed with knowledge, experience, and an absolute commitment to helping others recognize and escape the subtle forms of domestic violence that hide behind masks of care and concern. My story had become a testament to the power of the human spirit to survive, recover, and transform even the most insidious forms of abuse into sources of strength and purpose. Some battles leave scars that never fully fade, but they also create survivors who become warriors for others facing similar fights. In the end, That transformation from victim to victor to advocate might be the most powerful form of justice possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.